Hello everyone, my name is Delicacy, and this is Video Delicacies, where we seek to taste the greatest flavors that old games have to offer. I just played Shepherd's Crossing, which was developed by Success and published by Valcon. It was first released for the Sony PlayStation 2 in 2003, though the North American version wasn't until nearly 5 years later, in 2008. It was later released on the PlayStation Portable in 2009, the Nintendo Switch in 2022, and Steam in 2023. A few weeks ago, I went to my local used game store with a couple of friends. I didn't find anything that I wanted on that particular visit, but one of them found this game, Shepherd's Crossing. None of us were familiar with it, but we played the first hour or so together and we were all immediately charmed. I asked my friend if I could borrow the game to make this video, and they enthusiastically said yes. Shepherd's Crossing began by asking me to name the protagonist. I went with the default, which was Bob Collin for the full name, and Bob as a nickname. Bob was a traveler who had seen the world. Their journey led them through the village of Shepherd's Crossing, where they hit it off with a shepherd named Claire. Claire suggested that Bob try settling down there. She introduced them to the mayor, Raymond, who offered them a vacant house with the implied agreement that they would work as a farmer. The village was in the process of recovering after having fallen on hard times, and so the people there would be grateful to have the help. Claire also introduced Bob to a talking duck named Brammy, who provided the game's tutorials. Note that Brammy is a duck and not a goose. The game would inform me much later that the difference is the shape of the bill. Advancing the main plot in Shepherd's Crossing required me to collect specific items. In each chapter, Brammy would present me with a flowchart demonstrating how to reach whatever item I needed. For this first milestone, I needed rabbit fur, but before I could get that, I would need both cabbage and rabbits. To help me get started on my task, Claire stopped by the farm and dropped off a pair of marmots. The farm conveniently had a fenced area in the middle of it, so I placed the marmots there. The stone ornaments at the entrance acted as a sort of gate, allowing Bob to come and go freely but preventing marmots and other livestock from passing through. Marmots were seed-eating animals, so it was important that I keep them away from any seeds that I wanted to grow into crops. I could press L1 to advance to the next day. Time would only move forward when I wanted it to, and there was no limit to the number of actions that I could perform in any one day. The main resource that my farm had at this point was grass, and so I passed time to allow that to grow. Once it was long enough, I could cut it using a sickle. You can change which tool you have equipped using the triangle button and operate it with the square button. The current tool is displayed in the upper right. In addition to the sickle, I also had a glove that could be used to move fences. Most items can be picked up with X and thrown with circle. You can carry up to 3 things at a time, as shown in the bottom left. They operate on a first-in, last-out basis. If I left the farm by going to the north, I could travel to Caramella Market. Here I could exchange whatever I was carrying for different items. The grass that I had cut could be traded for pasture seeds, which I could plant to eventually get hay, which could then be traded for more marmots. There was no money in Shepherd's Crossing, only barter, so learning chains of items like this one was a major part of the game. The calendar started out in Dandelion Month, which is how it fancifully referred to spring. I spent most of this month just growing grass and raising marmots. By keeping them together, the marmots would eventually become pregnant and give birth. Excess marmots could be traded at the market for marmot meat. The exact nature of this transaction was thankfully not dwelled upon. Meat would have its own uses later, but for now it was valuable because it could be traded for cabbage seeds and berry seeds, items which were previously unavailable to me. After 30 days of Dandelion Month, the calendar changed to Grape Month, which represented summer. Different crops have different times of year when they can be grown. Hay could only be grown in Dandelion Month, but that was fine because I could now start farming cabbage and berries, which could be grown anytime until winter. The game introduced me to a new tool, the jar, which could be used for harvesting berries. After trading some berries for logs, I was given access to the carpenter tools, which could be used to turn logs into rounded pickets. This was one of several types of fences in the game. They look differently, but they all function the same. Notably, there's no way of snapping fences to a grid, you just have to toss them the way you toss any other item, so arranging them in a way that looks decent is almost impossible. I also didn't realize until later that held fences could be rotated 90 degrees by pressing R2. Once I had gotten mine positioned more or less how I wanted them, I traded one of my marmots for a rabbit and put it in the pen. Rabbits were an easy animal to feed, as they would happily devour either grass or leaves. However, something special would happen if they were given cabbages. The day after a rabbit ate a cabbage, their fur could be shorn using the shears tool. By collecting a rabbit's fur, I had completed the first of the game's 5 chapters, and a festival was held to celebrate. From time to time, the residents of Shepherd's Crossing would come visit Bob's farm. Over the course of the game, I got to know these characters fairly well. One of the most common visitors was named Marcia. She described herself as a forest guide, though I came to learn that she dreamed of becoming a confectioner. Marcia had 2 older sisters. Sophia, the middle sister, was a hunter, and Helen, the elder sister, was a clothier. These 3 became some of Bob's closest friends. The mayor Raymond and the shepherd Claire, both of whom I've already introduced, would also visit on occasion, as did Claire's younger brother, Kay. Other villagers included Samson the butcher, Morgan the blacksmith, and Merrill the dyer. The game presented Shepherd's Crossing as an idyllic community in which each person contributed in their own unique way, though it would have been nice to have also seen what it's like to be a disabled or elderly person in this society. Many of the scenes with these villagers were educational in nature. They would often describe what it was like to live and work in this farming town in greater detail than was represented by the game mechanics. I found these moments, and the art associated with them, very charming. The second chapter was called A Tale of Wheat, and the goal of this chapter was to harvest wheat. Brammy's flowchart made it look like a simple task, but it took me a lot longer than you might think. But before I set about working on that, I had something else that I wanted to do. At this point, I had grown cabbage. Aside from producing rabbit fur, cabbage had another use. It could be traded at the market for a terrier, the first of many dog breeds in the game. While on the farm, dogs needed to eat meat. Once they had been raised to adulthood, though, they could be moved to the kennel, which was to the east of the farm. Once in the kennel, I could give the dog a name. I could also teach them skills to be used in the hunting minigame, but we'll get to that a little later. Bob's farm was bigger now than it was in the first chapter, roughly double the size that it was before. I needed to rearrange my fences because the edge of the farm that I had been using to keep my animals penned in had now moved away. The extension came with 4 small signs with pictures of trees on them. I could place these wherever I wanted, and a couple of days later, trees would be planted in those locations. Other than that, the new space was vacant for me to do with what I wanted. I realized at around this time that I could hold R1 to run. It wasn't necessary on the smaller farm, but now that I had more ground to cover, it was a useful ability to have. I would even later realize that I could press L2 to teleport directly to another place on the farm. I'm normally pretty thorough about trying out all of the buttons when I start a new game, but the first thing that Shepherd's Crossing taught me was that one of the buttons would pass to the next day without even asking for any kind of confirmation, so the prospect of pressing buttons seemed scary. Now, I could have simply looked at the manual to learn this information, but that's neither here nor there. Rabbit fur could be traded for seeds of either wheat or buckwheat, so I planted some of each of those. Shortly after that, it became the autumnal acorn month. On the save screen, it's referred to as Chestnut Month instead. I then sheared some more rabbit fur and traded that for a chicken. The chicken needed to eat seeds, so I put them with my marmots for now. Berry farming was becoming the most efficient way to keep my animals fed. Every time that I harvested berries, leafy scraps would be left behind, which I fed to my rabbits. I could then exchange the berries themselves for 3 berry seeds, replant one of them, and feed the other 2 to my marmots and chickens. I had to be careful not to overfeed the animals though, because seeds left sitting around would eventually start to sprout. My now medium-sized farm had a southern exit leading to a second market called Knotpot, which had new items available. Eggs laid by chickens could be traded there for buckwheat seeds and wheat seeds, giving me a more direct route to those items than rabbit fur. I found a grasshopper wandering around my farm. Marcia told me that it was a danger to my crops, but I wasn't sure what to do with it, so I just put it in the trash. Sorry, grasshopper. There were some other similar pests. butterflies were attracted to cabbage and snails to grapes. But I mostly left those alone and they didn't give me any trouble. Since the first 2 months had been 30 days each, I was caught off guard when, after only 20 days of Acorn Month, the wintry No Grass Month encroached upon my farm. The snow smothered the wheat and buckwheat that I had been growing, entirely resetting the progress that I had made toward the chapter's goal. Other than winter pansies, which I didn't have yet at this point in the game, crops could not be grown in this month. Thankfully though, the seeds that I had set out were fine and were allowed to remain where they were until Dandelion Month when they would start growing anew. The game had told me very early on that I should stockpile hay to feed my animals through the winter. Hay could be broken down into cut grass to feed the rabbits and grass seeds to feed the other animals. No Grass Month was another 20-day season, and there wasn't a lot to do on most of these days, so I was quickly back to Dandelion Month, marking the start of Bob's second year in Shepherd's Crossing. I turned my remaining hay back into pasture seeds to grow more hay for the following winter. I also traded some rabbit fur for wheat seeds to get back to work on that project. Meanwhile, a molehill had appeared at the south end of my farm. Fortunately, it was far away from my crops, but its growth was alarming, so I needed to do something about it. As soon as I was able to start harvesting cabbage again, I traded some for 2 more terriers. Once those grew up, they were able to start defending the farm from the subterranean threat. It took me so long to get to a point where I could start addressing the issue that I wasn't sure whether 2 dogs would be enough to keep up with the molehill's growth, but in time, they were able to handle it. By the end of Dandelion Month, my buckwheat was ready to harvest, but it was a couple of more weeks before I could collect the regular wheats. In the meantime, I separated my animals into separate pens, and I got a bee box to collect honey from bees. Honey was a very versatile resource that could be traded for several different practical items, but it could also be used to get decks and cute fences. If you wanted your farm to look nice, it seems like you would want to gather a lot of honey. Daikon, a crop which I had just started to grow at this point, could be traded for various types of flower seeds. Flowers were mainly useful for decorative purposes, but they would also help attract bees to the farm. Once I had gotten my wheats, another festival was held, bringing about the end of that chapter. Entering Bob's house in the corner of the farm would allow me to save and load the game, but it also included an option called Brammy's Diary. I'm not sure how a dog holds a pen, but I found his handwritten recollections of the game's events to be delightful. There were some oddities about the diary. For example, the name of Claire's brother is written as Kai, rather than using his localized name Kay. Also, I could have misunderstood something, but it seemed inconsistent from whose perspective the diary was written. Sometimes it was explicitly Brammy's voice, but it also sometimes described experiences that happened to Bob in first person. Perhaps Brammy just thought of the farm as his and of Bob as his employee. There was a separate section of the diary called Dishes, which contained descriptions of meals that had come up in the game's story. This was a bit of a peculiar inclusion because I only got 6 of these in my playthrough. It was cool that each one had its own illustration, though. These make me wonder whether there was a time in its development when Shepherd's Crossing was planned to have cooking mechanics. Many of the ingredients mentioned in these dishes' descriptions are items that exist in the game, so it seems possible. Shepherd's Crossing's 3rd chapter was called A Tale of Boars. My objective this time around was to acquire a rare delicacy called ham. Brammy's diagram showed that I would need to get ducks before I could get boars. I traded some wheat for ducks and gave them their own pen. Ducks were yet another seed-eating animal. However, when given wheat or buckwheat seeds specifically, they would grow duck feathers in much the same way that rabbits given cabbages would grow rabbit fur. Wheat and buckwheat seeds were still a sparse commodity at this point, so this wasn't a fast process. The duck feathers item had a pleasingly round shape. 3 of them could be traded for either a goat or a boar. By the time that I had saved those up, it was already No Grass Month again. Boars ate dead grass, which was not an item that I was allowed to move around. It would simply appear in my farm late in the year where grass had once been. This meant that I wanted my boars to be able to roam around the farm freely in order to find dead grass to feed on. However, boars could also eat my crops, and I didn't want that. My solution was to use fences to divide my farm in half. The east half would be where I grew my crops, and the west half would become a wilder area where the pigs were allowed to graze freely. A side benefit of this plan was that it had my boars and my needle leaf trees in the same location, which is how you get truffles. During this chapter, I got several new dogs, a dachshund, a corgi, and a retriever, and I had gotten a basset in the previous one. I'm not sure whether keeping any of these dogs on the farm would have had mechanical benefits the way that keeping terriers around keeps moles at bay, because I put each of them in the kennel basically as soon as they reached adulthood. Time went by. The game was becoming kind of hypnotic. After a while, I just carried out all of my tasks without even thinking about them. Every day, I checked if any of my crops were ready to be harvested. Then I went around checking if any animals needed to be fed. Then I went to the next day, and I did it all over again, and again, and again. This is, of course, the appeal. Eventually, I arrived in the middle of year 3. I traded a boar for meat, but to complete the chapter, I still needed to cure that meat into ham. To do this, I required an item called a ham box, which, like a boar itself, cost 3 duck feathers. Boar meat left next to a ham box turned into partial ham overnight, and after about 10 days, the partial ham became ham. The village held a festival, and it was on to Chapter 4. I think it's time that we talk about one of the more unique aspects of Shepherd's Crossing, the hunting minigame. It's essentially turn-based RPG combat. But let's start from the start. When I would register a dog at the kennel, they came with a set of skills already learned. I could then teach them additional skills by moving them from Bob's pool to theirs. This was a one-way transaction. I couldn't take the skills off of the dog after teaching them, however, Bob's skills would refill over time, so I never ran out as long as I never tried to train multiple dogs at once. The number of a skill indicated how many times it could be used per hunt. The dog's breed determined their starting skills, which skills they could learn, and the total number of skills they could have. At the start of each day, there was a small chance that one of the villagers would show up at Bob's farm to invite them hunting. Early in the game, this was usually Marcia. In the mid-game, it was usually her sister, Sophia. And by the end, just about anyone could show up. The game would give me a brief description of what we'd be hunting and what dogs my opponent was bringing along. Yes, you heard that correctly, the hunting partner was called an opponent. Once I had assembled a team of up to 3 dogs of my own, the hunt would begin. Each hunt consisted of a single battle. The hunt's targets were on top, my opponent's team was on the left, and my team was on the right. The goal was to have more points than the opponent at the end of the battle, which would occur after there were no more targets available or after a set number of turns. Ties went to the player. I could use a dog's attack skill to lower an animal's HP. The hunter who reduced an animal's HP to 0 got a number of points that varied based on what kind of animal it was. Once the animal was down, either hunter could claim it using a dog's collect skill. Collecting an animal gave the same number of points as downing it. The early hunts were easy because Marcia never bothered to collect anything, leaving easy points on the table for me to grab. Many types of animals had ways of avoiding the hunters, such as burrowing in holes or hiding in trees, and I needed dogs with specific skills in order to counter these measures. This is where the game got kind of complicated. The order in which each combatant acted during a given turn was determined by what kind of actions they were taking. Animals hiding themselves went first. Then dogs taking actions to uncover hidden animals happened after that. Then attacks, then collecting. So you might, for example, tell a dog to attack a target that it can't currently hit because you know you're telling one of your other dogs to uncover it. You might also tell a dog to collect an animal that isn't at 0 HP yet, because you know that one of the other dogs is going to attack it. Thinking one step ahead like this is the easiest way to get an edge on the CPU opponents, who always base their actions on the state of the battle at the top of the turn. There were some interesting combat puzzles in here that were satisfying to solve, but just as often there were hunts where I didn't have whatever skill I needed, and so I couldn't really participate. Damage taken by dogs didn't go away automatically after battle, but I could bring meat items from the farm into the kennel for healing. The extra step of needing to leave and re-enter before being able to heal, though, meant that I sometimes forgot to do this and got stuck bringing a damaged dog on a later hunt. There were many rewards for participating in hunts. If I successfully won, I'd often receive items like meat and pelts that I could bring back to the farm. It was even possible to get items early this way. For example, I got wool from a hunt well before I had a sheep of my own. Completing hunts is also how I would get new skills. These would go first into Bob's pool and could then be taught to dogs. Sometimes these skills came courtesy of my hunting partner, while other times they were taught by the hunted animals themselves. Finally, all of the points earned during hunts went into a total, which I could then spend to buy items. Most of the items that could be obtained this way were cosmetic. There were a surprisingly large number of them, and as far as I know, most of them could only be obtained using points. You could potentially make a very fancy looking farm if you bought enough of these, but it would take some patience to do that much hunting. Anyway, that was a lot of words to describe a part of the game that is basically optional. You can get some nice items out of it, sure, but I'm pretty certain that there's nothing stopping you from completing the game without ever accepting a hunting invitation. The next chapter was titled A Tale of Grapes. As you might guess, my goal this time was to grow grapes. Brammy told me that I needed to plant them by grape month and that they would be ready to pick in acorn month. It was already acorn month now, so I knew immediately that this chapter was going to take me at least another in-game year to complete. My farm was embiggened again to its third and final size. I had anticipated this growth and stocked up on fences ahead of time. I expanded the Boars area southward and added some more trees to it. There was a new market called Ciara available to the west, where I was able to trade ham for grape seeds and wine casks. I also got a sheepdog, which was the last new dog that I got in my playthrough. That no grass month, a snow person appeared on the edge of my farm. Brammy said that I could get rid of it if it was in my way. Did he build it? By the middle of dandelion month, my grapes had begun to sprout, and in grape month, they grew into grape trees. I was briefly concerned that their description mentioned tomatoes, but it seems like that was just a translation error. By the end of the month, I had green grapes, still not quite ready to be harvested. But a few days into acorn month, at long last, the grapes were ripe. While most crops need to be replanted from seeds after being harvested, grapes left behind dormant grape trees which would sprout again the following year. Once the grapes had been gathered, it was time for the final tale to be told. But for now, let's take a moment to discuss the boxes of Shepherd's Crossing. Make yourself comfortable, because we've got a number of these to consider. We'll begin with the North American box, as that's the version that I played. I think that the composition is really interesting. The logo is up at the top, and the characters are all the way down at the bottom. The large gap in between evokes the fresh air and wide open spaces of the countryside. And the colors are great. I love the high saturation blues and greens and the purple shading on the mountains and trees. I get what they were going for with the logo. I don't personally care for it, but it's the only blemish on what is otherwise a truly fantastic cover. Now let's look at the box for the Japanese version of the game. The title, Yokoso Hitsujimura, could be translated as Welcome to Sheeptown. You know, I don't get to say this often, but I like the JP cover less than the NA one. Trading those bold colors for this nostalgic storybook style is a tough sell for me. However, the logo is an improvement, and I really like how all of the animals are drawn here, so it's still a pretty good box in my opinion. Up next is the PSP version. The art style on the North American box is one that was prevalent among low-budget games from Western developers at the time, so to me, it just looks like a Facebook game. Japan's PSP box is a huge improvement over it. It's similar in concept to the PS2 cover, but I like the execution much more here. I think the sharpness makes a big difference. The alpaca sticking their head over the crowd of sheep is very funny to me, but it's extremely unfortunate how the group of chicks at the bottom are almost completely covered by the logo. Next, I need to show you how they're presenting this game for its recent Switch release. Look, I'm not going to claim that this art isn't adorable, but come on, that's not what Shepherd's Crossing looks like. The in-game character art is unchanged, so Claire still looks like this. This person wearing a petticoat they've got on the box is a stranger to me. Also, Brammy is just floating there, and the background is so blurry, and everything has this glow around it. Ugh. Let's move on. Finally, Shepherd's Crossing had a sequel, Shepherd's Crossing 2DS, which was released for the Nintendo DS in 2008. The art style for the characters differs drastically between these two boxes, with neither really resembling the characters from Shepherd's Crossing 1. The North American box, which appears to feature the same artist as the PSP one, does not appeal to me at all, but I think the Japanese one is fine. I really like the logo, particularly the signpost and Brammy standing on top, but it's odd to see the cube from the custom Robo logo turn up here of all places. The final chapter of Shepherd's Crossing was A Tale of Sheep. To complete the game, I was required to obtain a sheep, and to do that, I simply needed to ferment my grapes into wine. Wine casks worked according to the same principle as ham boxes. All I had to do was set the grapes next to them and wait. I had grown a lot of grapes, so there were 8 wines brewing at once. I started really speeding through these days, often passing 2 or 3 by at once before checking on the crops and livestock. I had felt out what Shepherd's Crossing had to offer, and at this point I was ready to get to the ending. Midway through the following dandelion month, the first of the wine was finished. The game tried to tempt me with offers of whippets and pointers, but I remained focused on the objective and cashed in my wine for one of those cute, fluffy sheep. There was one final festival, and then the credits began. There was a sweet montage of all of the villagers in the background, ending on Claire, who was holding a baby. I guess the implication is that this is her and Bob's baby, but aside from her inviting them to live in Shepherd's Crossing in the opening and then holding a bouquet in the ending, there wasn't really any suggestion of romance between them in the game itself. Maybe there were some amorous scenes in between that I missed on my playthrough. There must be at least one where she plays that ocarina, right? Anyway, before we say goodbye to it, let's take a quick tour around Bob's farm in its final state. Up in the north corner was where I grew the berries and cabbage, which I used to feed my animals. Below that were the pens where my marmots and rabbits lived. To the east from there was the field where I grew my wheat and buckwheat. And past that were my chicken and sheep pens. And one of my huge item stockpiles. This is how you store extra items in Shepherd's Crossing, by tossing them in big heaps on the ground. West of that was my wine fermentation and ham curing area, as well as my vineyard. I was also growing some pasture in this area to make hay. The whole forested area north of that was the Boars domain, except for the duck pen and another massive storage depot. I had never spent any of the 207 points that I had accumulated from hunting, so in celebration of beating the game, I decided to buy the most expensive reward, the goddess statue. To my surprise, the goddess statue actually had a mechanical benefit, protecting the farm from inclement weather. Huh. Completing Shepherd's Crossing took me 19 hours and 52 minutes. In Bob's world, that amounted to 4 years and 14 days. And while I did complete it, there was still a lot that I left unexplored. I only raised the required animal types, but there were also geese, goats, llamas, yaks, donkeys, raccoons, ferrets, and bobcats. And there were a bunch of dogs that I never got too. I never milked a cow and made cheese, which I believe is something that you can do in this. This is a game intended to be played for a very long time, and I'm extremely grateful that it had an ending that was achievable in a reasonable period. This was my first time ever playing a farming sim, and the length of these games is a major reason for that. This is a genre that, by and large, caters to a type of player who doesn't play a lot of different games. Someone who wants to buy one game and then spend the next year with it. That's a totally valid way to enjoy video games. I think most of the people I know are like that, but I personally prefer to play a game for a couple of weeks and then move on to the next one. That said, it's easy to see how someone might fall in love with a game like Shepherd's Crossing. It's relaxing to zone out while performing repetitive tasks in it, and you get access to new items just frequently enough to keep it from growing stale. While I don't have much to compare it to, I can at least say that I had fun with it. If you're fortunate enough to have one, please support the retro game store in your area, and you too can find gems like this one. Thanks so much for watching. It was satisfying for me to step outside of my wheelhouse this episode. I've been wanting to try making a video about a game from a genre that I don't normally play. Let me know how you thought it went by leaving a comment or by simply pressing the like button. If you're enjoying my videos, please also consider joining my Patreon. Your support would really mean a lot to me, and you could see your name right here in the next episode. If this was your first time watching Video Delicacies, I end each one by placing the game I've just played on a ranked list with all of the other games that I've covered. This is a subjective ranking based on how much I personally enjoyed it. And I did enjoy Shepherd's Crossing, but if I'm being honest, I liked it least out of the games on this list, and so it takes 8th place. Congrats to StarFox64, which is no longer at the bottom of the rankings. In the next episode, it's time for me to finish the fights. I'm going to play Spyro Year of the Dragon. If you haven't watched my videos on the first 2 Spyro games yet, you've got about a month to get caught up. I hope that I'll see you back here then.